In documenting the social and political changes that continue in the period after that, the 1960s and forward, you should see a connection to what we've talked about before. I note here two things we've discussed previously: the invention of sort of modern birth control, the youth revolt. What you should see is those are fitting under the rubric of growing youth tension and growing changes in society. But to carry things forward, also from things we've talked about before, you can see in terms of social developments, things that are attracting the youth. One of the things that emerges during this time period is the development of green parties. These are parties actively committed to trying to find ways in the aftermath of the OPEC oil crisis to champion environmentally friendly, pro-environment political policies. What are the ways in which we can structure our economy and our society in order to abuse the planet less? These are the commitments of many of these green parties that start to rise across Europe. Another commitment on the part of not only Green Party, but in terms of a social development, is a commitment to nuclear disarmament. Now, this is both out of environmental duty, but in many ways it's helpful to underscore just how constant that fear of the Third World War is. If you put yourself in the position of a European, the problem with the Cold War is that any stupid disagreement and struggle or miscommunication between the United States and the Soviet Union carries with it the possibility that all of life is going to be expunged in Europe proper, regardless of who fires the first shot. Because if the Soviets invade Western Europe, well, the U.S. plan is to use tactical nuclear weapons to obliterate Eastern Europe and try and destroy as many Soviet divisions as they could. The Soviet response to any action like that, of course, would be to launch their own missiles. And so if you're a European, again, it fits with that existentialism, it fits with the sense of absurdity. The sense is life is absurd, so let us champion policies that might lessen that absurdity. And one of those principles is nuclear disarmament, a commitment by many, and indeed there's some overlap between Green Party membership and those who are in favor of nuclear disarmament, though it's not an equal one-to-one. The commitment on the part of many Europeans is to nuclear disarmament for their own livelihoods and well-being as much as any broader philosophical or political point. But that helps us turn towards political developments. And what I want to do is take you through the major political developments in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and help carry you forward to the end of the Cold War. So what are some of the major political developments? One of them, sort of going on in the background but critically important, is the process of decolonization. From the 1950s through the 1970s is a period in which the world radically changes. Namely, the colonies of much of the European empires rise up and seize their independence. Sometimes peaceably, sometimes it involves violence and conflict, but across Africa, across Asia, this is a time period in which these peoples are rising up and seizing control of their own governments and their own destinies. Now, in this, that doesn't seem that significant. We don't think in terms of European empires anymore. But in the context of this course, and when I began this module, I said, I hope you see the strands and the connections. This one should be apparent. From the very beginning of this course, we've talked about the expansion of Europe overseas. It is expanding, it is pushing outward, it is trying to conquer new territory. Think of the 7 Years' War, think of the expansion in Africa and Asia during new imperialism. And now, well, now Europe is being pushed out. Europe is being pushed back. This is a sea change in the development of, or if you will, the direction of Western civilization. But it's telling that attempts to claim liberty abroad were also matched by attempts to claim liberty at home. In 1956, there was an uprising against the Soviet-backed communist government in Hungary. The belief is they can maybe topple the regime and put something new in its place. Unfortunately for the Hungarians, that quest for liberation is going to find little help. Functionally, they rebel and they hope or expect that the U.S. is going to get involved, but remember that policy of containment. The U.S. is maybe not happy or thrilled with the Cold War, but threatening or aiding this Hungarian revolution might carry with it new conflicts and the potential for war that the U.S. is not willing to risk. And so the Hungarians rebel, hoping and expecting to find foreign support, and instead the Soviets come in with tanks, crush the rebellion, and arrest and kill many. And indeed, no one was free from the threat of Soviet repression. The leader of Hungary at this time, Imre Nagy, did not escape. Eventually, he is executed 2 years after the Hungarian uprising. In the post-Soviet period, there's a famous monument to him here in Hungary. But his death, the death of the Hungarian uprising, seems to signal that the Soviets, despite Joseph Stalin not being in charge, is not willing to countenance any independence from its satellite states. And further attempts by Soviet governments or Soviet peoples to liberate themselves from under the Soviet thumb find no success either. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, the people rise up attempting to create a new government that is more open than the one that was in place. Indeed, the commitment is to try and create socialism with a human face. And they believe that this has a chance to succeed. But as with Hungary, the Soviets eventually bring in troops. They invade not only themselves, but in accordance with some of their other Eastern European allies, and the Prague Spring is put down. And so in this, what you should see is, in Europe, the pursuit of peace and liberation is not proceeding well. But ironically, even as sort of this repression is still in place, there is a lessening of tension between the superpowers themselves. From 1970 to 1980, and actually a little before then is probably a good way of putting it, there is a period of what is known as détente, a thawing of Cold War tensions, a lessening of tensions between the Cold War powers, and this leads to increased communication and even agreements on limiting arms, an attempt to stop the superpowers from an arms race, to even discuss limiting arms as a sign of new communication and new cooperation. Indeed, by far the most famous example of this period of détente involved space. Now, if you think of any sort of movie of the space race, what you should remember is, in the background of every American effort is the implicit threat that if we don't get to the moon, the Soviets will beat us to it. If we don't get a man out, the Soviets are ahead of us. What that underscores is even space exploration, something not really militarily valuable in terms of getting to the moon or something like that, was turned into a competition, was turned into tensions between the superpowers. And now what happens during this period of détente? You have a period in which space is now an area of cooperation. You have a joint mission between cosmonauts and astronauts. Instead of trying to beat the Russians, the Apollo-Soyuz mission is an attempt to work together in space. And this spirit of cooperation even starts to extend to Europe itself. The best example of this attempt to craft sort of a new way of interacting to fit with this period of détente in a European context is the new leader of West Germany, Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt is the former mayor of West Berlin, and he's deeply concerned with trying to find ways to work with the Eastern Europeans and the Soviets. He's well aware of the costs of the division of Europe, the division of Germany. He was mayor of a town where people and families were separated, literally, by that Berlin Wall. And so he knows the costs associated with this conflict, and he wants to try and do something about it. Brandt, as leader of the Social Democratic Party, attempts to put in place a new policy known as Ostpolitik, or East politics. And what this is an attempt to normalize relations between West Germany with the communist states of Eastern Europe and even the Soviet Union. He's attempting to normalize relations between West Germany and these communist governments. The hope is that this will further communication, it will further cooperation, everything from making it easier for families to visit one another across the Cold War divide, but perhaps even find common ground to work together politically and economically. Brandt, during his tenure, even attempted to heal even deeper wounds in European or German history by famously going to Warsaw, and while there visiting the Warsaw Uprising, Ghetto Uprising Memorial in Poland, and falling on his knees, if you will, in penance for what had occurred there. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the ghetto of Warsaw, was where the Nazis had put the Jews of Poland and from across Europe as they had shipped them east in preparation to send them off to the death camps. And in the late period of the war, the Jews had secreted in weapons and undertook an uprising against the German occupiers, which was brutally put down with violence. And this was a memorial. And so to have Brandt visit this, many people believe this is not only the real first public recognition of the shared German history in terms of the connection between modern Germans and the Holocaust, but a real beginning of a new stage in German history and German public relations, where public consciousness rather, where they recognized that they had to come to grips with, they had to grapple with the Nazi past, rather than simply saying, "Oh, that was done by Germans, that was done by bad people, that's no longer us." But as I noted, the era of détente only lasted until 1980. We shifted back to a period of increasing tensions with the rise of a new American president, Ronald Reagan. He championed a new, strong U.S. foreign policy against the Soviet Union, not only challenging it politically, but also rhetorically. As Reagan is elected, there is an opportunity to, if you will, return to the cold from the period of détente towards the Cold War. Now, to be fair, it's not all Reagan's quote-unquote fault. The Soviets did themselves no favors in proving that détente only went so far, as in 1979, in order to prop up a puppet Soviet regime, the Soviets invade the country of Afghanistan in an attempt to try and promote the growth of communism there. Invading a separate sovereign nation is no way to say that you're really committed to détente either. In the 1980s, the communists, recognizing some of the problems within their country, economically and otherwise, decided to appoint a reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev, to the position of leadership. And he, as a youthful, vigorous man, championed policies of reform to try and bring more transparency to government, more improvements to the economy. But faced with Reagan, there were tensions. And indeed, tensions grew worse because as Gorbachev is attempting to put in place his reforms of the Soviet Union, Reagan is championing the potential of a new arms race that will even extend into space. Reagan champions a system known as the Space Defense Initiative, SDI. It's nicknamed in the press Star Wars, after the films made famous during those decades, and even now, of course. Reagan remains committed to trying to develop the technology necessary to create a missile defense system, a system that will allow him to knock out Soviet missiles or any missiles from reaching the United States. And Gorbachev, who's dealing with a faltering economy under desperate straits, worrying about whether or not his economy can cope with just under normal conditions, let alone trying to compete in this new area of space. This is causing tensions between the superpowers. And indeed, tensions continue because Reagan, in combativeness, is more than willing to combat in the form of rhetoric as well. Kennedy, if you remember, visited the Berlin Wall and spoke how he cared for the freedom of the people of West Berlin, that Ich bin ein Berliner and all the rest of that. Though left out of that speech, unsurprisingly, was his response upon hearing that the Berlin Wall was being constructed. As he said to a confidant, a wall is a darn sight better than a war, though he uses some more colorful language. What this suggests is that Kennedy was committed to that policy of containment. The Berlin Wall was horrible, it was awful, but frankly, it's better than a war. So all of these speeches at the Berlin Wall about freedom, at the end of the day, Kennedy's not willing to, if you will, upset the apple cart. In contrast, Reagan goes to the Berlin Wall and directly challenges, if you will, the bona fides of Gorbachev as a reformer, telling Gorbachev, if you really believe in these principles, if you really believe in these principles of freedom, well, come here and tear down this wall. So again, Reagan championing a policy of combative engagement with the Soviet Union. But even as Reagan is challenging Gorbachev directly, things are starting to reach a tipping point. In 1989, the government of East Berlin was racked by increasingly large and increasingly powerful demonstrations against their regime. Fundamentally, the people wanted reform. The East German government had been the most hardline Soviet government, often most strongly committed to repressing their people through a secret police known as the Stasi, and the people were starting to push for reform. They wanted a Gorbachev of their own, but some even began whispers of saying, forget Gorbachev, let's have true freedom. And as these demonstrations continue and grow larger and larger, the East German government grows worried as to what will happen. And as they contemplate different changes, a miscommunication about governmental policy makes things moot. The people catch wind that the people will be allowed open access through the Berlin Wall. And when they hear this, again, this is a miscommunication by the government, millions start streaming towards the wall, and the overwhelmed border guards with no orders from the government, with no clue what's happening, simply let the people through. And at a stroke, the Berlin Wall is no more. Millions stream from both sides of Berlin carrying hammers and pickaxes and sledgehammers and tear down that wall. It's not Gorbachev, but the German people who do that. And the tearing down of the Berlin Wall is representative of the collapse of Soviet control of Eastern Europe generally. And no matter what the situation, communism was collapsing. In Czechoslovakia, in something that's known as the Velvet Revolution, it followed the script of Berlin, if you will. Public protests led to eventually a peaceful transfer of power and a collapse of the communist government. And even those hardline Soviet regimes were turning away. The state of Bulgaria, which was the most closely aligned with the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1989, it also transferred in 1989 from Soviet single-party government to multi-party democracy. And those changes, that pushback against communism, was not confined to Eastern Europe. It was coming for the Soviet Union as well. Gorbachev's attempts at reforming the Soviet Union had achieved two things. First, they had disappointed reformers who believed that his reforms had not gone far enough. Secondly, they had upset conservatives who thought he had gone quite too far. That's sort of the danger of being the reformer. You manage to annoy everyone. This left Gorbachev in a very weak political position, and in the aftermath of an attempted coup by conservative hardliners to push Gorbachev out of power and reassert hard old-line communism, Gorbachev found his political position fatally undermined. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian state, decided to push to dismantle the Soviet system entirely, and on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev resigns, and the Soviet Union itself ceases to exist. In discussing all of this, I think this is a somehow fitting photo. A picture of the Berlin Wall, a symbol of tyranny and communist repression, now turned into a canvas for artists in a new, free, and unified Germany. My hope from this course is that in taking you through all of these changes, all of these developments, you're left with, well, as this image conveys, hope. That if such a symbol of tyranny can be transformed into an artistic vision of peace, well then perhaps as we face new problems, new political realities, new social changes, it's possible for Western civilization to continue to find ways forward, find ways to develop, and perhaps create a more peaceful and better world.